Ukraine has hit a Gazprom plant 1,000 miles inside Russian territory as its troops launch counter-offensives in Donetsk, and Donald Trump reveals he thinks that Vladimir Putin has let him down. Kharkiv again. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. I should start by explaining the slightly unusual surroundings that I find myself in. I am at the British consulate in Istanbul, and I've come here because the head of Britain's MI6 has been speaking. Sir Richard Moore made his valedictory speech, and I'll be coming to what he said later on in this episode. But we're going to start with the news of a spectacular Ukrainian drone strike on the Nefechim Salavat refinery plant, Gazprom refinery plant, some 1,000 miles inside Russian territory. Significant because it's part of this long-running campaign that we've talked about. A senior Ukrainian banker I've seen today analysing that could cost Russia around $600 million a month in lost incomes if that plant is knocked out of action. That's not clear the extent of the damage. Local Russian officials said that two types of aircraft drones hit the plant, igniting, as we've seen many times, an inferno, huge plumes of black smoke billowing into the sky. And curiously, this one elicited on Twitter a congratulatory note from the British comedian John Cleese. President Zelensky has announced that Ukraine has been fighting a counter-offensive. He said one of our counter-offensives in eastern Donetsk around Pokrovsk and Dobropilya. You know that's an area where Russian forces have been grinding forwards for months. Pokrovsk was a key logistics hub. It is a shell of itself after all this fighting. Dobropilya remains safely in Ukrainian hands but has come under increasing pressure. And we saw a sort of brief Russian spurt through Ukrainian lines, threatening to cut a key road between Dobropilya and Konstantinivka. Ukraine appears to have contained that. President Zelensky said that Ukrainian troops have now liberated, in his words, 160 square kilometers of land. And he said that a further 170, I think that's what he meant, a further 170 have been cleared of Russian occupiers. Now that would suggest that the liberated areas, I would suggest that Ukrainian forces are in those areas, and the areas that have been cleared of the Russians perhaps suggest that the fighting has been so intense there that the Russians have left, but they may not be sort of fully retaken by Ukrainian forces. Slightly unclear from his words. Talking of words, let's look at Donald Trump's state visit to the United Kingdom. An extraordinary occasion. The pageantry, the fanfare was, even by British standards, almost off the scale, and that was clearly done to appeal to Donald Trump's ego, the first US president to get two state visits to the United Kingdom. What I want to focus on is what he said in his press conference with Prime Minister Keir Starmer. He talked about how he thought the war in Ukraine would have been the easiest conflict to solve. And of course, you remember from his campaign to become president, he said he would solve it in a day when he was back in the White House, and then that was moved to 100 days, and clearly those self-set deadlines have all lapsed, as has the deadline that Donald Trump imposed on Putin of demanding that he come to the table, that he sue for peace or face serious consequences. And we're yet to really see those serious consequences. But it felt like, and Donald Trump remains, wildly unpredictable and prone to flip-flopping, but he said that he felt Vladimir Putin had let him down. He said he thought that the conflict would be easy to solve because of his relationship with Putin. And the sense was, from his words, from his remarks, that the value of that relationship, he overestimated the strength of that relationship. And that's interesting, because if that is a heartfelt realization by Donald Trump, then that may help him to come round to the view of Ukraine's allies and so many in Europe who clearly see Vladimir Putin's war of aggression and his full-scale invasion for what it is, the threat to not just Ukraine but to European and global security. It's why so many countries are so insistent and ardent in their support for Ukraine. That brings me to what was happening here in Istanbul. Sir Richard Moore, the head of MI6, Britain's secret intelligence service, was giving his valedictory speech before he steps down as the chief. He's known as C in that capacity as Britain's foreign intelligence spy chief. He said he had seen no evidence that Vladimir Putin was interested in a negotiated peace. And he said Putin lies, he lies to himself, and that he has been stringing us along. That's the phrase he used, but I think perhaps a signal to Donald Trump rather than to those people who have called out Putin throughout this process, suggesting, I would say, that Putin has been stringing Donald Trump along. Sadly, there was nothing in that speech to indicate that the war will end soon. He was clear-eyed, as we have been, that Russia is grinding its way forward at a huge cost. And he made the observation again that Vladimir Putin appears consistently willing to sacrifice not just the lives of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, but hundreds of thousands of his own people too. He repeated that statistic that we've heard before: 1 million Russians, 1 million Russian casualties in this conflict. He said over 1 million Russian casualties, a quarter of them have been killed. And if we needed any evidence of the fact that Russia continues to prosecute this conflict, and that Vladimir Putin has no interest in peace, then perhaps we need look no further than the ongoing airstrikes and drone incursions. Of course, we talked a lot about the Russian drones entering Polish airspace. On that, one thing I think is important to note is that the Poles, Radek Sikorski, the Polish foreign minister and deputy prime minister, was very clear, as we reported in our last update, that they saw this as a deliberate incursion. He said the drones did not veer off course. And we also saw Britain's Prime Minister and Defence Secretary John Healey use the word attack. That was significant, but they have since rode back on that language. And the sense is that NATO appears to is not saying either way whether they think this attack was deliberate, and clearly that undermining Poland to some extent, giving themselves wiggle room, and it may be a deliberate tactic to try and de-escalate, to avoid forcing NATO's hand into a military response. What we have seen, though, is commitments to ramp up air defence along NATO's eastern border in Poland particularly, and we're going to see British Typhoons patrolling that border soon. But that hasn't stopped Russian drone incursions. Now, we saw debris of one Gerber decoy drone washing up on the Latvian shores in the Baltic. It's not clear how that drone got into the ocean and why, when it crashed, one presumes, in the ocean, whether that was linked to the Polish incursions. But it has washed up in Latvia, reminding us that other countries are being drawn in. And actually in Romania, we've seen, we just had this before, we've seen another Russian drone enter Romanian airspace. Now, there was a NATO response to that, although it was slow. What I think is interesting, what I want to talk to you about today about that, is that the Romanians tracked the drone coming into their airspace. It turned round, and we presume, we don't know for certain, went back to Ukraine, but they didn't shoot it down. And this struck me as not a great example of NATO's resolve if they're not even prepared to shoot down drones over their own territory. They've resisted Ukraine's demands to close the skies, to enforce a no-fly zone, to help Kyiv shoot down Russian weapons over Ukrainian territory. But by simply tracking a Russian drone over NATO territory and allowing it to fly out of that territory, potentially to do harm to Ukraine, that appears to be letting down Ukraine, I would argue, quite significantly. As ever, if you do have any questions, please ask them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can next time. And if not on the show, then I'll get into the comments and answer them there. Number one, do I think the Russian drones into Poland was a tactical misstep by Russia? Unfortunately, I do not think it was a misstep, because Russia, whether or not this was deliberate or an accident, and I would err towards deliberate, Moscow has got away with it. Vladimir Putin will be able to sort of boast to his tyrant pals, Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, look, Russian weapons have gone into NATO territory, and what has NATO done about it? Now, former Chief of Britain's Defence Staff, Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, who gave a speech in London last week, where he insisted that actually NATO's response had been huge, was the word he used, and he talks about this reinforcing of the air defence across the eastern flank. But fundamentally, whilst there have been strong words, there's been a convening of NATO, the Atlantic Council for Poland's Article 4 discussion. Nothing that's happened is going to materially change Russia's ability to prosecute the war in Ukraine. Donald Trump has made strong signals that he wants Europe to stop buying Russian oil, and the European Union appears to be bringing forward measures to try and wean itself off Russian gas, because remarkably, nearly 4 years into this war, many countries are still buying huge quantities of Russian gas. So there's an interdependence between these economies, even while they're on opposite sides of a hot war. It's possible in the medium to long term, because of those things, that this may prove a tactical misstep, but I would suggest that tactically in the short term, no, it was not a misstep by Russia. One of you writing, it's scandalous that after nearly 3.5 years, NATO doesn't have an air shield. I'd correct that slightly. NATO does have an air shield, and what we saw in Poland was a number of NATO allies coming together. The German Patriot missile batteries in Rzeszów, Dutch F-35 fighter jets joining Polish F-16s, all part of that response together. And again, it was a combined response down in Romania. What this shows, though, is perhaps that the air defence is not impregnable, and that is why it's being increased, or more resources being put into it. But there is a trade-off. The more that NATO puts into the air defence shield now, the more the aircraft are used to patrol the skies. That creates a sort of drain, or a strain, I should say, on military resources, and that fundamentally impacts readiness. So whilst there is value to deterrence in boosting and being seen to increase military patrols, air deterrence patrols over Eastern Europe, there is a cost to NATO, to militaries as well. Final question today, is Russia weak? The suggestion that I keep on portraying Russia weak in these updates, then I say that it's strong enough to hit Poland with drones, suggesting that perhaps we've been slightly contradictory. I'm really sorry if that is the impression we've given. Is Russia weak? No, Russia is not weak. Is Russia invincible? Absolutely not. Neither is Russia invincible. So Russia is absolutely not as strong as perhaps NATO thought it was, or indeed Russia thought it was, because Russia thought it would conquer Ukraine in a matter of days, and it hasn't been able to do that. It remains nonetheless a formidable military power. Its soldiers, largely perhaps because of its scale and the ruthlessness of its leaders, willing to throw so many people to their deaths or inflict on them serious injury. And it's because of that ruthlessness and scale of resource that it's able to continue prosecuting this war. Russia winning in the short term, Ukraine losing territory, does not necessarily equate to Russia winning this war ultimately, conclusively. And of course, that will depend how the war ends. That will depend largely, I would argue, on the resolve of Ukraine's allies to keep supporting Ukraine. But the prospect of a Ukrainian collapse, which is the victory that Russia wants to subjugate Ukraine, remains very, very, very distant. And one thing before I go, we should say there's an interesting anecdote about the British consulate here. I was just told by a diplomat that in the ballroom are a pair of chandeliers that were originally intended as a gift from Queen Victoria to the Russian Tsars, but they never made it. Let's have a look why. The speech has taken place in the British consulate in Istanbul. Magnificent surroundings. The ballroom here, I've just been told, has a couple of extraordinary chandeliers that were apparently going to be gifts from Queen Victoria to the Russian Tsars, but when the Crimean War broke out, they paused on their journey and were stored here until an ambassador decided they should be used in this building, and they were put in the ballroom, just behind me here. And apparently the roof They're so magnificent, the roof had to be strengthened. But anyway, back to Ukraine business. Thank you for watching. If you've got any questions, do ask them in the comments below.